everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into an incredibly intense, highly charged conversation pulled from a recent Side-Scrollers excerpt. The commentators in this source material really get into the weeds on the mechanics of algorithmic capture, extreme political polarization, and what they honestly believe is the crumbling foundation of our societal discourse. Now, I want to be clear right up front. Our goal here is absolutely not to take a side. Instead, we are just going to objectively and structurally map out exactly how these speakers build their argument, piece by piece. Okay, let's jump right in. The central anxiety driving this entire conversation boils down to one really stark question. Are we heading toward actual physical violence, or are we already locked in this invisible digital information war? Throughout this explainer, we're going to deconstruct exactly how the commentators arrive at their pretty alarming conclusion, tracing their logic all the way from the literal phones in our pockets to the current state of the nation. All right, starting us off, Section 1, the tech catalyst and algorithmic echo chambers. So, to really understand their conclusion, we have to start exactly where they do. According to the commentators, the root cause of all this massive societal division isn't actually political at first, it's entirely technological. They draw this explicit, step-by-step causal chain. Step 1. They argue that platforms like TikTok can categorize a user within just 3 minutes of logging on. 3 minutes. Step 2 is the isolation that follows. You get fed into an ecosystem where you are completely cut off from outside perspectives. In step 3, they claim this causes extreme political shifts, specifically citing young women moving further to the political left than any generation in U.S. history. And finally, step 4 is the real-world impact. This digital conditioning literally translates directly into voting for politically extreme candidates at the ballot box. Now, a completely crucial part of their argument rests on this specific term they use a lot, political capture. The speakers describe political capture as being totally trapped. You're locked in an algorithmic ecosystem feeding you just one single perspective. And what's really striking here is what they claim happens to your tolerance level. They argue that once you're captured by this system, your threshold for disagreement basically drops to 0. In their exact words, if you disagree with even 1% of the accepted narrative, you're immediately excommunicated and labeled a Nazi. Moving right along to Section 2, the policy impact, or what they call moral masturbation. Yeah, it's an incredibly provocative term. The speakers use it to ask what happens when these politically captured individuals actually gain power and start implementing policies in major American cities. They coined moral masturbation to characterize the act of supporting progressive policies strictly because it makes the supporter feel righteous or good about themselves. To the speakers, these are policies that might sound beautifully compassionate on the surface, but in their view, turn out to be completely destructive in practice. And they actually list some very specific real-world examples of this. They cite things like the continued release of violent criminals instead of protecting the taxpayers. They point to extreme leniency on drug offenses. They bring up enacting rent control and halting the sweeps of homeless encampments. According to the source material, a politically captured voter hears these ideas, thinks, hey, that sounds like the moral thing to do, and just votes for them on repeat. The speakers argue the end result is turning once great American cities into what they literally describe as gross third-world cities. Which leads us to Section 3, media and forced conformity. So the speakers believe this captured worldview doesn't just sustain itself, it's actually rigidly enforced by massive societal institutions. They see a very strict binary choice in modern institutional culture. On one side, you have the narrative. They argue there is exactly one accepted way of thinking, heavily controlled by a machine made up of bureaucracy, news networks, and the entertainment industry, which they say leans entirely left. On the other side, you have the outcasts. Within these industries, conformity is literally the only option for survival. You step out of line, you're pushed out entirely. But here's where the commentators ask a really fascinating question. Do the people working in media and entertainment actually believe the narrative they're pushing? Well, the speakers give their own diagnosis of the opposition's motives, and they argue that almost no one truly believes it. They divide the motivations into 3 roughly equal camps. First, about 33% are just going along out of fear, trying to fit in. Second, another 33% they characterize as having mental instability, specifically calling out kids on SSRI medications. And the final 34% are those seeking a sense of belonging or purpose because they were bullied or isolated in high school. The algorithm, they argue, just feeds this delusion and gives them a totally fabricated purpose. All right, Section 4, the escalation to information civil war. So you take algorithmic capture, throw in destructive policies, and add rigid institutional conformity. Where does all this lead? We are now hitting the climax of the source material's argument. The speakers firmly believe we are already in the middle of an information civil war, and they point to some very specific evidence to back this up. They highlight the intense legal weaponization of voting laws and redistricting. They point to real-world violence, citing riots, looting, and city destruction. They emphasize the sheer decimation of truth via propaganda and misinformation, and honestly, perhaps most chillingly, they point to what they see as the normalization of assassination attempts on political figures, noting how shockingly fast society just dismisses these events today compared to decades past. All of which leads the speakers to pose this incredibly stark, hypothetical question. If their side were to lose an election and end up living under what they fear would be a far-left communist administration, how long are people actually going to tolerate it? What happens when a massive chunk of the country feels they had absolutely zero voice and no legal recourse? They express some incredibly deep anxiety about society just hitting a breaking point. Now, you might be wondering, if they think it's this bad, why hasn't it tipped into total physical warfare yet? To explain that, the speakers point straight to the Second Amendment. Using the term pew-pews to refer to firearms, they theorize that the political left is actually orchestrating mass shootings specifically to justify gun buybacks and strip away the Second Amendment. And why? Because according to the commentators, the right's possession of firearms is literally the single solitary deterrent keeping the other side from kicking off an actual physical war. Section 5. Discourse versus cult mentality. To really wrap up their argument, the speakers draw a hard line in the sand, defining exactly who is fighting this information war. On their own side, they don't even necessarily identify as right-wing. They see themselves as centrists or just normies. They characterize their group as people eager to converse, willing to debate, and happy to shake hands and grab a beer afterwards, even if they completely disagree. In stark contrast to that, they characterize the left as a freaky circus cult. They don't view the opposing side as a political party at all, but rather as an absolute dogmatic religion that is utterly terrified of hearing any alternative perspectives. And to emphasize just how deeply they believe the left fears open dialogue, one of the speakers uses this wild pop cultural analogy. They claim the opposing side treats alternative viewpoints like Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter. The whole implication here is that the left believes merely hearing a differing opinion will somehow magically conjure evil into existence. It really paints a picture of an opposition trapped in a protective bubble of their own making. Okay, let's zoom out and look at the big picture we've just built. This is the explicit causal chain the speakers laid out for us. We start with the algorithms. Those algorithms breed impenetrable echo chambers. Those echo chambers then breed extreme, inflexible voting patterns. And finally, the collision of those uncompromising voting blocks is exactly what has created this current information civil war. We have definitely mapped out a seriously intense perspective today. But, regardless of where you might fall on the political spectrum, the sheer architecture of their argument leaves us with a really critical question to ponder. If the algorithms sitting in our pockets right now are fundamentally capturing our politics and filtering our entire worldviews, are we slowly losing the baseline shared reality that's required to even have a basic conversation with our neighbors? It is absolutely a question worth reflecting on the next time you open up an app. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning what you see.